Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Ashes in the Past. I'm so glad you're here. So, get comfortable, sit back, and relax as we journey through history together. Today, we'll uncover a remarkable true story that time almost left behind. Long before Hannibal became Rome's greatest enemy, he was simply the son of a defeated general. He was born around 247 BC, in the powerful North African city of Carthage. At the time, Carthage was one of the richest cities in the Mediterranean world. Its merchants controlled enormous trade networks, while its ships carried goods between Africa, Spain, Sicily, and distant ports across the sea. But Carthage had one powerful rival: Rome. For more than 20 years, the two powers had fought a brutal struggle, known as the First Punic War. When the war finally ended in 241 BC, Carthage had been defeated. It lost Sicily, surrendered much of its naval power, and was forced to pay Rome a massive indemnity. For many Carthaginians, the defeat was humiliating. For Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, it was something he would never forget. Hamilcar had commanded Carthaginian forces during the final years of the war, and had watched Rome emerge victorious. Rather than accept defeat, he turned toward Spain, hoping to rebuild Carthage's wealth and military strength. According to ancient tradition, young Hannibal begged his father to take him along. Hamilcar agreed, but first asked his son to make a remarkable promise. Standing before an altar, Hannibal swore that he would never be a friend of Rome. Whether every detail happened exactly as later writers described it, the oath became one of the most famous stories of the ancient world. Hannibal was still only a boy, but Rome would soon become the defining enemy of his life. He traveled with his father to Spain, where he grew up surrounded by soldiers and military campaigns. He watched armies train, studied different cultures, and learned how commanders earned the loyalty of their men. Then, in 229 BC, Hamilcar died during a military campaign. Hannibal had lost his father, but not the ambition he had inherited from him. Over the following years, he continued serving in the Carthaginian army, earning a reputation for courage, endurance, and leadership. Ancient writers described him as a commander, willing to endure the same hunger and exhaustion as his soldiers. Then, in 221 BC, at only 26 years old, Hannibal was chosen to command Carthage's forces in Spain. The boy who had once promised never to become Rome's friend now commanded an army. And soon, he would attempt something Rome believed was almost impossible. By 221 BC, Hannibal was no longer the young boy who had followed his father into Spain. He was now the commander of Carthage's most important army. His soldiers respected him for his courage, discipline, and willingness to share the hardships of ordinary troops. But Hannibal's greatest challenge was approaching quickly. In 219 BC, he attacked the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally on the eastern coast of Spain. After a long siege, the city fell. Rome demanded that Carthage surrender Hannibal. Carthage refused. The Second Punic War had begun. Rome expected the fighting to remain in Spain, or perhaps spread across the Mediterranean by sea. Hannibal had something far more ambitious in mind. He would invade Italy itself. But attacking Rome directly by sea was extremely dangerous, because Roman naval power dominated much of the western Mediterranean. So Hannibal chose another route. He would march overland from Spain, through southern Gaul, and then cross the Alps into northern Italy. It was an astonishing plan. His army included tens of thousands of soldiers, thousands of horses, and a small force of war elephants. The journey was brutal. Hannibal's men crossed powerful rivers, faced hostile tribes, and marched through unfamiliar territory. Then came the Alps. The mountains towered above them, covered in snow and surrounded by narrow paths, steep cliffs, and freezing winds. Men slipped from icy trails. Animals collapsed from exhaustion. Rockfalls and enemy attacks made every kilometer dangerous. The army suffered terrible losses. But Hannibal refused to turn back. He encouraged his exhausted soldiers, reminding them that beyond the mountains lay Italy, and the richest territories of their greatest enemy. After weeks of suffering, the survivors finally descended from the Alps. They were exhausted. Their numbers had been drastically reduced. But they had accomplished something Rome had barely believed possible. Hannibal had brought a Carthaginian army into Italy, approaching Rome from the direction it least expected. The Romans quickly gathered their legions. They believed Hannibal's weakened army could be destroyed before it recovered. They were about to discover how badly they had underestimated him. Because crossing the Alps was only the beginning. Hannibal had come to Italy to defeat Rome on its own soil. When Hannibal descended from the Alps in 218 BC, his army was exhausted and badly reduced. Rome saw an opportunity. If the invader could be defeated quickly, the war might end before Hannibal gained support in Italy. But Hannibal had spent years preparing for this moment. His first major victories came in northern Italy, where he defeated Roman forces near the Ticinus River, and then prepared for a much larger confrontation. At the Battle of the Trebia, Hannibal faced a Roman army eager to destroy him. Instead of meeting them with simple force, he prepared a trap. On a bitter winter morning, Hannibal sent cavalry across the river, provoking the Romans into pursuing them. The Roman soldiers crossed the freezing water, already cold, hungry, and exhausted before the real battle began. Hannibal was waiting. As the Romans attacked his main army, hidden Carthaginian troops suddenly emerged behind them. The Roman formation collapsed. Thousands were killed, while the survivors struggled back through the freezing river. But Hannibal was not finished. The following year, in 217 BC, another Roman army followed him near Lake Trasimene. Once again, Hannibal turned the landscape into a weapon. He concealed thousands of soldiers among the hills, while allowing the Romans to march along a narrow path between the mountains and the lake. Then, at the perfect moment, he attacked. Carthaginian forces poured down from the hills. The Romans had almost no time to organize. Some were driven toward the water. Others were surrounded and cut down. Within hours, an entire Roman army had been devastated. Rome was stunned. In less than 2 years, Hannibal had crossed the Alps, invaded Italy, and destroyed army after army. Fear spread through the Republic. But Rome refused to surrender. Instead, it appointed the cautious general Fabius Maximus, who understood that confronting Hannibal directly was exactly what Hannibal wanted. Fabius avoided major battles, shadowing the Carthaginian army while attacking its supplies. Many Romans hated the strategy. They wanted victory. They wanted revenge. And eventually, Rome abandoned caution. The Republic began assembling one of the largest armies it had ever placed on a battlefield. This time, Rome believed overwhelming numbers would finally crush Hannibal. Hannibal saw something very different. The perfect opportunity for his greatest victory. By the summer of 216 BC, Rome had suffered enough. Hannibal had defeated its armies at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, humiliating the Republic on its own soil. Roman leaders decided that caution had failed. This time, they would overwhelm Hannibal with numbers. Rome assembled an enormous army, one of the largest forces it had ever sent into battle. The two armies met near the small town of Cannae, in southeastern Italy. On paper, Rome appeared to hold the advantage. Its infantry greatly outnumbered Hannibal's. Roman commanders believed that if they concentrated their soldiers into one powerful formation, they could smash directly through the Carthaginian center. Hannibal understood exactly what they intended to do, and he designed his entire battle plan around it. He placed his weaker infantry in the center, forming a curved line that extended toward the Romans. His strongest African infantry stood farther back on both sides, while his cavalry protected the wings. Then, the Roman advance began. Thousands of legionaries pushed toward Hannibal's center, forcing his troops slowly backward. To the Romans, it looked like victory. Hannibal's line appeared to be collapsing, but the retreat was controlled. As the Romans continued advancing, their enormous army became increasingly compressed into the center. They were moving directly into Hannibal's trap. Then, the battle changed. Hannibal's experienced African infantry attacked from both sides, striking the crowded Roman formation. At the same time, Carthaginian cavalry defeated the Roman horsemen, circled behind the battlefield, and attacked the Roman army from the rear. The Romans were surrounded. There was nowhere to escape. Packed tightly together, many soldiers could barely raise their weapons. What followed was one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. Ancient estimates vary considerably, but tens of thousands of Roman and allied soldiers were killed, including senators, officers, and one of Rome's consuls. The Battle of Cannae became Hannibal's masterpiece. Even today, military commanders study the battle as one of history's greatest examples of double envelopment, surrounding an enemy from both sides and the rear. Rome had sent an overwhelming army to destroy Hannibal. Instead, Hannibal had nearly destroyed it. Across Italy, some of Rome's allies began questioning whether the Republic could survive. The road toward Rome seemed more vulnerable than ever. Yet Hannibal did something that has puzzled historians for centuries. He did not immediately march against the city. He had won one of the greatest victories in military history. But winning the battle and winning the war were about to prove very different things. After the disaster at Cannae, Rome appeared dangerously vulnerable. Its armies had been shattered. Thousands of soldiers were dead. Several important cities in southern Italy began abandoning Rome, believing Hannibal might finally destroy the Republic. But Rome refused to negotiate. This was the problem Hannibal had not been able to solve. He could defeat Roman armies, but he could not convince Rome that it had been defeated. Rather than risk another disaster like Cannae, Roman commanders returned to a more cautious strategy. They avoided large battles with Hannibal. Instead, they followed his army, attacked smaller forces, protected important cities, and disrupted his supplies whenever possible. Rome also possessed another enormous advantage: manpower. Even after losing tens of thousands of soldiers, the Republic raised new armies. Young men replaced the fallen. New legions marched into the field. And most of Rome's Italian allies remained loyal. Hannibal faced the opposite problem. He was fighting hundreds of kilometers from Carthage, deep inside enemy territory. Every soldier he lost was difficult to replace. Every year made supplies harder to secure. He desperately needed more Italian cities to abandon Rome, along with stronger reinforcements from Carthage. Some allies did join him, including the important city of Capua. But it was not enough. Rome's alliance system bent. Yet it refused to break. Years passed, and Hannibal remained in Italy. He continued winning smaller engagements, but the spectacular victories of his early campaign became increasingly difficult to repeat. Rome had learned from its mistakes. More importantly, it had stopped fighting the war on Hannibal's terms. Instead of concentrating everything on defeating him in Italy, Rome began attacking Carthage elsewhere. Roman armies fought successfully in Spain, weakening the territories that had supplied Hannibal with soldiers, money, and resources. Slowly, the balance of power began to change. Hannibal was still dangerous. Rome still feared him. But the general who had once seemed unstoppable was becoming increasingly isolated. Then, a young Roman commander began rising through the ranks. He had studied Hannibal's victories carefully. He understood his tactics. And instead of chasing Hannibal across Italy, he would attack the one place Hannibal could not afford to lose: Carthage itself. While Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy, Rome began searching for another way to win the war. A new commander offered the answer. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio had witnessed Rome's disasters firsthand, and understood how dangerous Hannibal could be. Instead of repeatedly attacking Hannibal in Italy, Scipio targeted the foundations of Carthaginian power. His first great opportunity came in Spain. The region supplied Carthage with soldiers, wealth, and military bases, making it essential to Hannibal's war effort. Scipio attacked aggressively. In 209 BC, he captured New Carthage, one of Carthage's most important strongholds in Spain. Over the following years, Roman victories gradually destroyed Carthaginian control of the region. Hannibal was losing the resources he desperately needed. But Scipio wanted something more decisive. He proposed an audacious plan. Rome would invade North Africa. Instead of trying to force Hannibal out of Italy, Scipio would threaten Carthage itself. It was a brilliant reversal. For years, Hannibal had forced Rome to defend its homeland. Now, Rome would force Hannibal to defend his. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in North Africa and began defeating Carthaginian forces. He also secured the support of Massinissa, a Numidian ruler whose powerful cavalry would become crucial to Rome's campaign. Suddenly, Carthage faced the danger Hannibal had once created for Rome. An enemy army was advancing through its own territory. Carthaginian leaders had little choice. After roughly 15 years of campaigning in Italy, Hannibal was ordered home. The invasion that had begun with an impossible crossing of the Alps was finally over. Hannibal returned to Africa, knowing that everything now depended on one final confrontation. Across from him stood Scipio, a Roman commander who had spent years studying his victories. The student of Hannibal's methods. was about to face Hannibal himself. After nearly 2 decades of war, Hannibal and Rome were finally approaching their decisive confrontation. The battlefield would not be in Italy. It would be in North Africa. In 202 BC, the two armies met near Zama, southwest of Carthage. On one side stood Hannibal, the commander who had destroyed Roman armies at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. On the other stood Scipio, the Roman general who had spent years studying Hannibal's methods. Before the battle, ancient sources describe Hannibal and Scipio meeting face to face. Hannibal reportedly attempted to negotiate peace, reminding Scipio how quickly fortune could change in war. But no agreement was reached. The battle would decide everything. Hannibal placed dozens of war elephants at the front of his army, hoping their charge would break the Roman formation. Behind them stood his infantry, arranged in several lines. But Scipio was prepared. Instead of forming his troops in the usual tightly packed formation, he created open lanes through the Roman lines. When the elephants charged, Roman soldiers sounded horns and trumpets, frightening some of the animals. Others simply rushed through the gaps Scipio had deliberately created. Hannibal's greatest opening weapon had failed. Then the infantry collided. 4 hours, the fighting remained fierce. Hannibal's experienced veterans resisted the Roman advance, while both commanders searched for an opportunity to break the enemy. But Scipio possessed an advantage Hannibal had relied upon throughout his greatest victories: superior cavalry. Roman and Numidian horsemen, including forces commanded by Massinissa, drove Hannibal's cavalry away from the battlefield. For a time, the infantry continued fighting without them. Then, the cavalry returned. But this time, it appeared behind Hannibal's army. The situation was painfully familiar. At Cannae, Hannibal had surrounded the Romans by attacking from the front, sides, and rear. Now, Scipio was using a similar principle against him. Hannibal's army collapsed. Thousands were killed or captured, and the general who had spent years terrifying Rome suffered his decisive defeat. Carthage could no longer continue the war. It accepted harsh peace terms, surrendered much of its military power, and lost its position as Rome's greatest rival. Scipio returned home as a hero, receiving the famous title Africanus. Hannibal survived. But the war that had defined most of his adult life was over. He had crossed the Alps, destroyed Roman armies, and brought the Republic closer to catastrophe than almost any foreign commander before him. Yet Rome had endured. Hannibal had lost the war, but Rome had not stopped fearing the man who nearly defeated it. And that fear would follow him long after the battlefield fell silent. The Second Punic War was over, but Hannibal's story was not. After returning to Carthage, he entered politics and attempted to rebuild the city that Rome had defeated. He introduced reforms, challenged corruption, and worked to strengthen Carthage's damaged finances. But Rome was watching him closely. To Roman leaders, Hannibal was still dangerous. This was the man who had crossed the Alps, destroyed entire legions, and brought fear directly into the heart of Italy. They had defeated his army. They had not forgotten his name. Eventually, Roman pressure forced Hannibal to leave Carthage. He entered exile, traveling between kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean, where several rulers welcomed his military experience. Even in old age, Hannibal continued advising enemies of Rome. and Rome continued searching for him. His final refuge was the kingdom of Bithynia, in what is now northwestern Turkey. When Roman influence reached even there, Hannibal realized that escape was becoming impossible. According to ancient accounts, rather than allow himself to be captured and displayed as a Roman prisoner, Hannibal chose to end his own life, probably around 183 BC. The general who had spent his life fighting Rome would never allow Rome to decide his final fate. Yet his death did not end his influence. For centuries, military commanders studied his victories. The crossing of the Alps became a symbol of extraordinary determination. The ambush at Lake Trasimene demonstrated his mastery of terrain and deception, and the double encirclement at Cannae became one of the most studied battlefield maneuvers in military history. But Hannibal's life also carried a deeper lesson. He proved that battlefield genius alone cannot always determine the outcome of a war. Hannibal repeatedly defeated Rome's armies. Rome responded by raising new ones. He shattered Roman forces at Cannae. Rome refused to surrender. He persuaded some Italian cities to abandon the Republic. But most of Rome's alliance system survived. Eventually, Rome stopped trying to defeat Hannibal on his terms, and attacked the foundations of Carthaginian power instead. That ability to endure disaster, adapt, and continue fighting became Rome's greatest weapon. Hannibal may have been the superior battlefield commander, but Rome proved to be the stronger war machine. And perhaps that is why his story remains so extraordinary. Rome eventually conquered much of the Mediterranean world. It defeated kingdoms, destroyed rival powers, and built one of history's greatest empires. Yet among all the enemies Rome faced, few frightened it like Hannibal Barca. He did not conquer Rome. He never entered the city as its master. But for years, whenever Roman parents wanted to describe a danger approaching their gates, one terrifying warning captured their fear. Hannibal is at the gates. More than 2,000 years later, Rome's empire is gone. But the name of the general who nearly brought it to its knees still survives.